I have to tell you, there are about 50 other organizations around the country today celebrating the legacy and birthday of Milton Friedman. And I'm delighted that all of you could join us on behalf of the Show Me Institute and the Friedman Foundation to celebrate today. By the way, I'm Rex Singfield. I'm the president of the Show Me Institute. Milton Friedman was a real visionary and an advocate for human freedom. You know, today as we look around the economic and the philosophical crises that we sometimes currently find ourselves in, it's more important than ever to look back and embrace his ideas and his arguments. Milton Friedman used not just scientific, but also sometimes good practical arguments on behalf of liberty and economic development. He's honored around the world as one of the greatest champions of freedom in our time. And you know, he started off as a young technical economist until Friedrich Hayek, the founder of the Mount Pelerin Society, got a hold of him and told him that you ought to use your vast analytical skills to start studying public policy. And that's what he did. One of the world's greatest microeconomists came up with some of the greatest ideas in public policy. But I'm not going to say any more about that because we have Dr. David Levine here to talk about Milton Friedman. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the Show Me Institute. It is a public policy research organization, otherwise known as a think tank, and we address the public policy issues of the state of Missouri and the localities therein. We hire academics, we contract with academics to study things that we think are important to the state, to promote growth, to promote opportunity and freedom. This week we experienced the single highest spike in website visits to our Show Me Institute News and Government Transparency site. An article written by, believe it or not, an intern, Caitlin Hartzell, received national attention with over 2,000 website visits in one day. And after attending Senator McCaskill's healthcare town hall meeting Monday night, Caitlin reported on the criticisms aired by the constituents. So I encourage you to visit showmepolicypulse.org and review it. Another tool you might want to look at is Show Me the Grades, which is a part of our website that evaluates all of the public schools in the state of Missouri, and it is being updated with the latest DESE information. And another one is in showmeliving.org or Show Me the Taxes. If you want to figure out what your total state tax burden is, just answer a few questions and it will be right there, and you will be dismayed and shocked and angry. All of those are appropriate responses. You can also go to our showmedaily.org, which is the blog which addresses all sorts of things. And all of these are available through our website, showmeinstitute.org. I want to thank Washington University for providing this terrific facility and for helping us host this event today. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about Professor David K. Levine, who's going to say a few words about Milton Friedman, or he's going to say a few words about whatever he wants, because he's a full professor, you know. He is the John Biggs Distinguished Professor of Economics here at Washington University in St. Louis. He's president of the Society for Economic Dynamics, fellow of the Econometric Society, research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the Sloan Research Fellowship Program Committee. Now, the Econometric Society. In 1990, when the late, great Merton Miller was flying over to Sweden, and I was fortunate to become, my wife and I, a close friend of Mert for over 30 years, he's flying over to Stockholm to get his Nobel Prize. This is a true story. Pilot comes on the air, and he says, in first class we have Dr. Friedman, who's flying to Stockholm to receive a Nobel Prize. Shortly thereafter, a flight attendant comes up and says, Dr. Friedman, what are you getting your Nobel Prize in? And he said, econometrics. And she said, oh, there must be a lot of that going around. So Dr. Levine did his graduate training and completed it with a PhD in economics from MIT. He's made major contributions to economic science. His ongoing research focuses on growth theory, innovation, and intellectual property. He has made presentations and had huge influence all around the world. Some of the places he's addressed and consulted to are the International Monetary Fund, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Canadian Ministry of Industry, etc., and especially important, the Cato Institute. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. David Levine.
Well, I was instructed to be brief, so the introduction may last longer than the actual speech. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Show Me Institute for organizing this fabulous event. I've had a little bit of interaction with the Show Me Institute before. Tim Lee, who was at the Cato Institute before he came for, I guess, a year or for 2 years to the Show Me Institute, was a friend of mine, a very, very fine fellow. He's left now to go to graduate school at Princeton, but a very fine person. I had some interaction with him about the Institute. But anyway, what I was instructed to talk about was to talk about Milton Friedman, so let me do that. I didn't actually know Milton Friedman personally, which I'm sorry about. I did in fact know his son David, who was my colleague for several years, and the two of us used to lock horns regularly at lunchtime when we were at UCLA together, and I'm really quite sorry that I never had the opportunity to do that with his father, who I understand was also a horn-locking type of individual. So I'm certainly familiar with Milton Friedman, both his work and his legacy. And interestingly enough, I guess as economic methodologists, he and I are probably opposite ends of the spectrum. Sort of what element of mathematical modeling constitutes good science. He and I, I'm sure, would have locked horns at any opportunity that we would have had. And despite that fact, I'm actually quite familiar with his scientific work. He's famous actually for two major pieces of scientific work. His work on the consumption function. He published a book called The Theory of the Consumption Function. And his work, which is probably more famous, on monetary theory, including the monetary history of the United States. One of the interesting things is this work was done quite a long time ago, so we can look back in retrospect. And of course, a lot of scientific work never doesn't wind up standing the test of time, although it may be very important at that particular time. Of those two major scientific contributions, one of them has stood quite well the test of time. The interesting fact is it's probably not the one that you think. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that at that. What I really want to talk about, and I think it's most relevant for this particular group, is Milton Friedman's contribution to freedom, to liberty. And there I cannot think that I disagree with Milton Friedman at all. So whatever scientific differences we might have, I think we see pretty much, well, he's dead, so we don't see eye to eye on anything, I suppose. But I would agree with him very strongly and profoundly on that. There are really very few public intellectuals of the stature of Milton Friedman who lobbied and worked tirelessly on behalf of freedom the way that Milton Friedman did. And there's a couple of things I'm going to say. For example, I can think of very few public figures, okay, of Milton Friedman's stature who have ever argued strongly for the legalization of drugs, of recreational drugs. That's very unusual, okay? Even amongst people who support liberty, that's very, very unusual. One of Milton Friedman's great life achievements, one of the things I think he was proudest of, was the abolition of the draft. Okay, he worked tirelessly. I'm actually a personal beneficiary of the fact that he successfully got rid of the draft. I was actually the very last, I had a draft card. I was in the very last group. They drew no draft numbers my year, and in the following year, there was no draft anymore. He also understood, I want to say a few words about kind of current contemporary events. The financial crisis is something we've all sort of heard talk about. And Milton Friedman understood, I think, very well the difference between capitalism and what I would call corporate capitalism. And I think we've seen a sort of a great deal of the corporate capitalism going down through the government in the recent year, and the theory of bailing out the big. And I think that's great. I think Milton Friedman has a great deal of relevance. There's a fine line that a libertarian like Milton Friedman walked in dealing with public policy. And I want to just say a word about where that fine line is. So if you talk about regulation of financial institutions, I think particularly at the end of his career, Milton Friedman argued for more or less complete deregulation. There are economists that like to abolish the Federal Reserve Board, basically allow what's called free banking. Neil Wallace is one of them. Milton Friedman at the end of his career also made those same arguments. Okay. There's another group of economists who argue for very strong regulation. right? That we should provide either explicitly or implicitly guarantee of deposits as we do, and that we should also regulate banking portfolios relatively carefully. The interesting thing, I think, is that all economists on both sides of that divide agree on one thing. And the one thing that they agree on is that the one thing you can't have is partial deregulation. What you cannot do is you cannot either, you can't make banks too big to fail and be willing for the federal government to bail them out, or explicitly guarantee their deposits through federal insurance, and not regulate their portfolios. So you constantly have lobbyists coming to Congress saying, oh, we want deregulation. And what do they mean by deregulation? They mean you guarantee the results, and we get to invest in whatever risky things we want to invest in. Okay? And that is total insanity. Okay? Better to have complete regulation than that kind of deregulation. Better maybe even to have complete deregulation, but the middle is worse than either extreme. And Milton Friedman is a man who recognized those kinds of subtle policy distinctions. Right? And if he were today, I suspect he would probably not be arguing we should abolish the Fed, we should go to total deregulation. Not because he would think that that's not the right thing to do, but because he would view it as politically infeasible and understand that within the realm of choices that are probably relevant today, the total regulation one is probably the only one that we're likely to see, and that the intermediate one is just catastrophic. I want to say one other word about the financial crisis as well on Milton Friedman. Chile in 1981 had a financial crisis. People think of this as something very unique, our financial crisis. It's not at all. Economists have studied dozens of these all around the world. There was one in Chile in 1981, very similar to what we're facing today, that was resolved very successfully. Okay. By whom? By Milton Friedman's students, the Chicago boys in Chile. And by the way, what they did is they did the opposite of what we did. They didn't bail out the big banks. They failed the banks. They made them go bankrupt. Okay. They took them over. Nationalization, by the way. You think that would be a dirty word for somebody like Milton Friedman or students? No, they nationalized the banks because they had failed. Just as in any bankruptcy proceeding, right? There has to be a legal proceeding for recycling the firm, and then sold them back to the private sector. That worked extraordinarily well. And it's really unfortunate that the lobbyists for our banks have succeeded in preventing us from doing something like that. All right, so at any rate, that's Milton Friedman. We have a speaker today, Kevin Chavous. I just want to say, I'm not supposed to introduce him, but I'm just going to say two things. One, of course, is that Milton Friedman was a tireless advocate of competition education, recognized the importance of education. And I'm going to listen to Kevin with special interest because he has been very involved with the schools in Washington, D.C., as I understand it. Well, I actually happen to be a product of the public schools in Washington, D.C. So I have enormous admiration for a man who is willing to tackle that particular difficult project.
Thank you, David. You know, I wasn't as lucky as you because I did get drafted and was stationed in Fort Riley, Kansas. Now, most of you don't know this. I'm going to give you a little history lesson. And the purpose of Fort Riley, its mission, is to protect eastern United States from Indian attacks. And the whole time I was there, there was not a single Indian attack. So I expect all of you to show me a bit more respect going forward. Now, I think most of you are familiar with the tremendous advances in effort in school choice by our today's guest speaker. I have for long respected his work and shared his passion for education reform. You have at your places complete bios, but I just want to tell you a few things about my good friend Kevin Chavous. He's a noted attorney, author, and national school reform leader. He's a former member of the Council of the District of Columbia and the chair of the Council's Education Committee. Mr. Chavous was at the forefront of promoting change within the district's public school system. His efforts led to over $500 million new dollars being made available to educate children in D.C. and one of the most successful complete school choice programs. Since leading the council, Mr. Chavous has emerged as one of the nation's most respected and courageous and influential education reform leaders. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for Education Reform and serves on the board of the Black Alliance for Education Options. More recently, Mr. Chavous served as a member of the Education Policy Committee of the Obama presidential campaign. Please welcome my good friend, Kevin Chavous.
I do have some prepared remarks, but I was sitting next to Rex, and he fired me up, so I'm just going to say what I feel. I mean, it was almost like a communist conspiracy or something. I feel like he just wanted to get me going. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with Show Me Institute, and I'm a big fan of Show Me's work, and I know several of the board members here, Kevin and Beavis and Rex, and I'm very proud to be affiliated with the work that you do. It is noteworthy for me to be here on the anniversary of Dr. Friedman's birth. I was in Kansas City last year, so some of you may have heard me in Kansas City, and as I said to many of you who were there last year, I'm going to watch to see and make sure you don't fall asleep as I say some of the same things. I am going to refer to one thing that Dr. Friedman, and I want to make sure I get the quote right. The professor was talking about how Dr. Friedman was such an advocate for freedom in this country. And in his landmark book, where the idea of parental school choice and vouchers were birthed, the legendary paper, 1955 paper, The Role of Government in Education, he wrote, and I quote, "We have reached the conclusion that government financing of primary and secondary schooling is entirely consistent with private administration of schooling, and that such a combination is both more equitable and more efficient than the existing linkage of financing with administration." In shorthand, what he is saying is that we need to make sure that that combination exists in terms of private administration of schooling and the public administration of schooling. And the danger is that if you rely on just the government administration of schooling, it can be catastrophic. And you know, what's interesting is a funny thing happened on the way to that enlightenment that Dr. Friedman wrote of in 1955. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we saw just what he predicted would happen, in fact, happen. The monopolistic approach of having government run our school system, particularly in the K through 12 arena, led to disastrous results. The morphing of bureaucracy through administration, special interests, union rules, all of these things that had little to do with the advancement of educating the American population, all of these things led to disastrous results. So much so that while today's focus is understandably on the plight of our urban school districts, the deep, dark, dirty secret is all of our educational outputs in the K through 12 arena are sliding. And among the world standings, where we regularly be in the top 3 among the industrialized nations in the world in terms of our educational outputs for children, in the last study we were 25th. We have countries that just got a whiff of freedom within the last 15 years in Eastern Europe who are far surpassing us in our educational outputs because they understand the notion of individualized attention to the student. They understand the idea of parental choice. They understand the idea of making sure that they have a system that serves children as opposed to a system where the children and the public serves the system. And I think it's more than noteworthy that the parental choice movement, which was in fact birthed by Dr. Friedman's 1955 paper, has now created an environment where the notion of choice will be the salvation for education in this country. I can be pretty strident. I'm the first to admit that. And usually when I speak with folks about the state of public education, because I think to understand is, as I like to say, to understand where we need to go, we need to understand where we've been. And the other thing we need to do, we need to be brutally honest about where we are. You know, I am as some of you know, a recovering politician. I mean, I was in elected office for 12 years. I ran for mayor in D.C. in 1998. And understanding freedom, like Dr. Friedman, I was really free when I left office. And so, you know, it's easy for me to throw stones and say, you know, if you're running for office, you should speak freely. But I would tell you something. You know, Americans have always responded more to straight talk as opposed to the gobbledygook that we hear from a lot of our folks who are a lot of my fellow elected brethren. And to speak honestly and directly about what's going on in today's schools is not to preach or proselytize doom and gloom. It is to be candid about the fact that America is failing its school children. We are failing our school children. McKinsey & Company just this spring, this past April, released a first of its kind landmark report on the economic consequences and impact of the achievement gap in America. They looked at how the difference between how the haves and have-nots perform on standardized testing, how it's affected the country from an economic point of view. And as they did their studies, they not only compared what was going on state by state around the country, they also looked at how we rank from an economic point of view in terms of our educational shortfalls vis-a-vis the international global community. And their conclusions were striking. The first conclusion is that the result of the achievement gap in education in this country has amounted to an economic recession, a permanent economic recession larger than the recession we're currently experiencing. They also said that the international impact has made us non-competitive from an economic point of view. So I commit you to look at the McKinsey & Company report because it's the first time that non-educators actually tried to qualify and quantify the impact of us not educating our children. Not only that, I was talking to the table with my folks there about the outputs and the educational outputs, and you know, Dr. Martin said she heard that DC's making gains, and we are making gains. But see, I don't really believe in I don't celebrate marginal increases in educational outputs for children, or marginal increases in test scores. You know, we have schools now and school districts that operate at 20% proficiency. That means that 80% of the kids are failing. And then the superintendent de jure, or the school reform plan de jure, which y'all know well in this area. I think y'all have had a fair number of superintendents. But they and I'm not criticizing them. This is what they have to do, and this is frankly what they're used to doing. They come up with a reform plan that says, give us 3 to 5 years and we're going to fix it. And you know, that 20% in 3 to 5 years could be 30%. So that means you should celebrate the fact that we've gone from 20% of the kids passing to 30% of the kids passing. There's this whole dumbing down that has taken place, where because things are so bad in terms of our outputs, because we're failing to take care of our kids, we celebrate mediocrity even at our kids' expense. And it wasn't supposed to be like this. You talk about the precepts of freedom. You talk about what was expected with the founding of this country. You know, Thomas Jefferson believed that what we should have happen is that we need to have an educated population in order to have a participatory democracy work. And this idea that each and every citizen should be responsible to make sure that his or her child is educated so that they can understand the responsibilities associated with democracy. They can understand the responsibilities and obligations associated with freedom. And they can be educated in all of the relevant areas so that they can participate the way it was envisioned in our Constitution. And what has happened over time is, as government got more and more involved in the delivery of these educational services to children, starting with Horace Mann in the 1830s in Boston with the compulsory attendance law, where it was understood that, we do need to make sure there are some standards in place. We do need to make sure there's some uniformity in how we deliver these services, but it morphed into something that did not serve our children. This one-size-fits-all approach to education service delivery has failed our nation. And yes, I was on President Obama's Education Policy Committee, and as you might imagine, I didn't think I would survive the campaign. I thought they'd kick me off after one of those conference calls we had. But I survived. And largely, I was the one, and there were several others, but I was probably the more strident, because I said, look, why in the heck, after all we've gone through in this country, why should we, when it is clear that what we have been doing is not working, why should we continue to celebrate mediocrity, and why should we promote the status quo over everyone else? I didn't sign on to this campaign, to say I'm for change and to act like I'm not. And this idea of what we need to do to change education for our kids, I think, should be radical and complete. See, I don't believe in fraying around the edges. I don't believe in an investment of millions and millions of dollars every year so that we go from 20% proficiency to 30% or 40%. See, if you're not over 90% proficiency, then you shouldn't be in the business. That should be the goal. This dumbing down is permeating our society. So much so that what we have done, we have compensated for the lack of effort and positive results that we have had in educating our children by making everyone work around the ignorance that is among us. McDonald's started it. Kids can't count, put pictures on the cash register. Curriculum designers. I don't know if any of you are in the room, but I don't mean to just call you out, but it is what it is. Textbook manufacturers, curriculum designers say, War and Peace is 1,000 pages. That's too much for these kids. So you can get an abridged, dumbed down version for like 700 pages. Everything we do now is designed to compensate for what we're not doing for our children. Mainly what we're doing to our children. So it is my view that in terms of how we move forward and the policies we support, that parental choice is a big part of that. Another thing that Friedman said, and then I want to bring in a discussion about D.C. He said, he and his wife Rose wrote in a letter, "We have concluded with the achievement of effective parental choice. It requires an ongoing effort to inform the public about the issues and possible solutions. An effort that is not episodic, limited to particular legislation or ballot initiatives, but that is educational and ongoing." The reason why I point that out is because it is so frustrating for those of us who toil every day and labor to try to turn the light on this issue. It gets very frustrating, and it's easy for some to want to give up. But that is the last thing we should do. Like George Washington and Abe Lincoln and all these people we hold in high esteem in this country who continue to fight for freedom, we should not stop this fight, and nor should we let our weary eyes hold us from what we should be doing. Because Dr. Friedman was smart when he said this has to be ongoing. And where I live, D.C. is a great example. In some, the D.C. education reform story is something that speaks to a consistent, non-compromising, dedicated battle for change, and I believe we're on the verge of great things in D.C. for that reason. When I took over the chairmanship of the Education Committee back in 1997, we had just passed the charter school law, and it was very interesting. I didn't know much about education, but it struck me that anything that all the negative social indices in society was directly traceable to the lack of a quality education. Where the people were educated, you had less homelessness, joblessness, crime, drug abuse, criminal behavior. I realized our prison population, just similar to prison populations all over the country, over 85% of these people incarcerated don't have a high school degree. So there's a direct correlation that it hit me like a ton of bricks back in 1996, 97, when we were debating the charter bill. We need to focus more on this. So I fought for and got the education committee. And the union came to me right after I got the committee, and they said, look, you know, we've always liked you. We thought you were a bright young man. And I said, thank you for that. And then they said, but you know, we have a problem with you. And I was taken aback because I didn't know the education establishment politics. I didn't know the union politics. I was really focused on other things. And I said, well, what problem? Well, you voted for the charter school bill, which we don't like that. We don't like the fact you voted for a charter school bill. But since you're now chairman of the education committee, you can make sure they don't get funded. So we're going to watch you and hope you don't fund them. Because, you know, just because you have a bill doesn't mean that you have to fund the bill. And I said, but wait a minute. Now, I had some of these innovative young people come to me with ideas for charter schools. I said, DC Public Schools had talked about a residential facility and a residential school. They've been talking about it for 15 years. These kids from Princeton got on a whiteboard. They have a charter application. I think it looks like a good idea. I said, Bill Marriott and the hotel and restaurant folks came to me with this idea about a hospitality high school. So the kids could graduate and go into the culinary arts, go to train to be chefs in Paris, and then go to college. They could never do that in DC Public Schools. So union, tell me why I should not sign on to some of these things that the traditional system's been talking about doing for years, but they could never do it because of the bureaucracy and the work rules. And they said, we don't want you to fund it. And, you know, I'm the worst person in the world, like Rex Sinfield. I'm the worst person in the world to say, don't do something. I may be second worst, but I am one of the worst. And lo and behold, we funded. We went on a track, Mayor Williams and I, where we ended up funding the most prolific charter movement in the country. We have nearly upwards of 35% of our public school kids in charter schools. And the Washington Post gave us the biggest validation that we've ever had a few months ago when they had on the front page above the fold headline that the charter school test scores in reading and math were over 20 points higher than DC Public Schools. And that's largely because that, you know, our charter schools had made sure, and I was insistent on this, that they weren't charter schools just in name only. They were charter schools in terms of having a rigorous application process, which means that not just anyone could open a school, which is what you see in other states that really don't want charters, but they say if we open up a bad school and they fail, then we can say charters don't work. I've heard district authorizers say that in those stark terms. So we had a rigorous application process. We had a rigorous monitoring process, but we gave them the freedom and autonomy to do their own thing, and we closed down the bad schools. You can't have a legitimate choice program that allows incompetency to flourish. So we shut down some of the bad schools. And then on top of that, so we had several years of this experience that was positive. In 2003, as Rex alluded to, Mayor Williams and I sat down with President Bush and Rod Page, and we put in place the first ever federally funded scholarship or voucher program. And it's on that I really want to spend some time, if you will indulge me. See, this program has worked over the past 6 years. We have testimonials from kids all over the country who were able to go to college that otherwise wouldn't go there. And it's been studied ad nauseum, and the studies show that parent satisfaction is over 85%. There's noticeable, discernible increases in reading of these kids. And on top of that, we have now parents who are involved in their child's education unlike what we've ever had before. So, as soon as the program is up for reauthorization this year and the new administration gets in and my good friend Arnie Duncan becomes Secretary of Education, they issue something saying that they're going to shut down the program so those 1,700 kids will have to find another place to go in the fall. Well, that didn't sit too well with me and several people like me in D.C. And they said, just put them in D.C. public schools. They said to our new Chancellor, Michelle Reed, you know, you need to just be ready to absorb these 1,700 kids. Well, we weren't going to take that lying down. And it was, and from my vantage point, it was real important to show, and this goes to Milton Friedman's point about making sure your fight and your commitment is ongoing and not episodic. Because of the years of success that we've had with alternatives to the traditional government schooling, unbeknownst to us, we had a groundswell of public support for our voucher program because parents see that it works. We've had over 100,000 kids benefit from charter schools. We've had over 10,000 kids benefit from our voucher program. And a poll that was released by the Friedman Foundation this week showed that over 70% of D.C. residents of all walks of life support the program, and 79% said the program shouldn't end. On top of that, we had a letter from a majority of the D.C. City Council that was signed by those members supporting our program. It was a landmark situation because my fellow Democrats on Capitol Hill couldn't believe that an urban legislature would sign on to a parental choice voucher program in D.C., and they did. And the reason why that's important to note is because if you strip bare all the politics, at the end of the day, we're supposed to be making sure we create an educational environment for children. And if we're not doing that with the one-size-fits-all model, then we should be open to alternative opportunities. And the beauty is in D.C. now, the public is open to that. And they are accepting of it. And yesterday I was at a press conference where Senator Lieberman, who sponsored our bill for reauthorization, Senator Susan Collins, Voinovich, Feinstein, and former Mayor Williams and I, we spoke at this press conference. And these kids were there. And one parent stood up and said, you know, if it wasn't for this program, I would have lost my child. At the end of the press conference, totally unrehearsed, tears in her eyes. And at the end of the day, as Senator Lieberman said, as the press conference was closing, this is why we support this program. See, because this is the American solution we need in education. We need to make sure that we create environments for our children to learn, irrespective of where those environments exist. And the essence of our democracy is dependent on us doing that. Now, I really believe, and Rex and I have a bet, he's going to pay my half if I lose. That's a little something I didn't tell you. But I really believe we're going to get this bill reauthorized. Because I actually believe that the support locally has surprised some of the leadership on the Hill. But D.C. is not alone. I've done work with Governor Jindal, several African American legislators in Louisiana. They now have the most robust charter movement in the country, even outstripping us in terms of the number of kids in charter schools. They have over 50% of their public school kids in New Orleans in charter schools. I helped Governor Jindal with his scholarship bill that was just reauthorized. And you talk about demand. See, sometimes those of us who up in this rarefied air, we lose sight of the fact that parents on the ground don't get caught up in the petty politics of the day. They want what's best for their kids. You know, the last year when we passed the scholarship bill in Louisiana, we had 1 week to get the schools signed up to participate. So in 1 week, we got 56 schools to sign up. And we had to have the school sign up before we could have the parent drive. And we had 1 week after that to get the parents signed up. So there was concern because we knew that the schedule was truncated on purpose because they wanted us to fail. But there was concern that we wouldn't be able to get the word out and that people wouldn't show up. On that Saturday morning, when we opened it up for registration in New Orleans. We had over 500 people. The doors opened at 9. We had 500 people getting there as early as 6 or 7 in the morning to sign their kids up for this program. During the course of those several hours, we had 2,000 families, all low-income families, come through the door trying to get their kid in a quality school. Waiting patiently, being told they needed more information. Some of these families and parents had never done anything like this. They went back home to get copies of their electric bill to prove residency and came back. Some of them had to take 2 or 3 bus transfers to come back to the registration site. And we had a successful year where we had over 700 kids that qualified. This year we're going to double that because the demand is what it is. People want the best for their children. So when thinking about Dr. Friedman, even in the rarefied air that he and Professor Levine travel in, it is clear that he understood the notion of freedom in America better than most. Even back in 1955, when he wrote that now renowned paper. He understood that freedom shouldn't be shackled by us limiting the exposure and the educational options that parents have for their children. He actually understood the essence of what education really means, that education is about choices. It's about choices for parents. It's about choices for children. He understood that in order for our country to remain strong and for us to remain competitive, for us to continue to have the intellectual firepower necessary to be what we like to be in terms of world leaders, that we have to open up education beyond the government bureaucracy that's been thrown in front of us. He understood and appreciated this idea that our future really does lie in how we handle and treat our young and how we educate them. And anything short of that is shameful on us. So I tell people all the time that this is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It's not a socioeconomic issue, in stark terms. The results have socioeconomic impact. It's not a racial issue. It is an American issue because it does come down to the fortitude and sustenance of the democracy we love. And that's why I continue to fight for this issue. I continue to fight for these children, and I continue to fight so parents can be empowered to choose for themselves. It makes absolutely no sense for the government to say, your child needs to go here to school, even though we know this school is failing. So with that, I thank you all very much, and I look forward to taking some questions as the lunch continues. Thank you.
I wanted to run around the block a couple of times.
Thank you.
What kind of horn locking do you have with NEA and like-minded groups?
Yeah, well, they know me.
They should.
Real quick funny story. Rex loves stories like this. My good friend Howard Fuller, who's landmark mentor and leader in the pro-choice movement, he was superintendent of schools in Milwaukee when he started the first voucher program and caught a lot of heat. He called me one day, Rex, and he said, Kevin, they're having this school choice thing. They're trying to get it going in Portland, Oregon. Do you mind going? Because I can't make it. I said, sure, I'll go speak. Let me check my schedule. So, but he didn't tell me the whole story. So I get on the airplane, go to Portland, and at the airport I see these folks sort of looking at me. It's about 4 or 5 of them. And then I do a radio thing, and they're outside the station. And then when they have a press conference at school, and they're there, and they're writing notes. And so finally, in the evening when I speak, I said, I'm a little unnerved. These people are they're following me around. And so I asked the people, I said, well, who are these? Oh, these are the NEA folks. They knew you were in town. And so I called Howard. I said, Howard, these people following me around? Yeah, I knew they were going to be there. So I didn't want to go. I didn't want to deal with them. I said, well, thanks for letting me know, you know. But no, they don't even debate me anymore. Because, you know, I have this view of what we should do that is frankly pure. I'm not holier than thou, but it's pure in this way. See, the NEA will talk about, you know, we've got to do this for teachers. They talk about these adult issues. This is the way we've always done it. What are the results? Blah, blah, blah. Well, my purest view of how we educate children is if the proposal, the approach will help a child or group of children learn, I'm for it. If it doesn't, I'm against it. So that means by definition, all these failing schools, I'm against it. That means by definition, all these schools that work, I'm for it. And see, I think that that's the way we should look at education. It is that precious a commodity in this country. We should not put filters or layers on how we evaluate what's best for children. If it's best for children, we should support it. And we should have the courage to stand up. And so, you know, when I deal with the union folks, I'm very dismissive of the partisanship and the simplistic approach that they take to self-preservation, because that's what it's about. I have debated NEA folks for an hour and not have one of them during that hour mention children during the whole time. And it works like magic. At the end, during the final remarks, I said, you know what, I'd have far more respect for what they're saying if they had mentioned children once. And they never do. Because their myopic view is on self-preservation and special interests that has nothing to do with the outputs for kids. And I think that's the most important thing about education. What's best for kids? So, to answer your question, yeah, I know the NEA well.
Kevin, could you explain in charter schools, what are some of the specific things that they do to get the really good results? What's the secret sauce in charter schools?
Well, let me tell you the real secret sauce, and that's an excellent question. Charter schools are public schools, but the essence of the charter school relationship is that it is a contract with the authorizer or the public entity that grants the charter. And you file an application where you lay out your goals and timetables, your financial management system, your curriculum, and your goals and timetables in terms of student achievement, how your curriculum is going to be designed, and you have, in most places, five years in order to fulfill that charter or meet those goals. And each year there's an audit, there's a review of how you're doing and the like. But the real difference between charter schools and traditional schools are work rules. Because the union in all these school districts has work rules, which are the antithesis of good education and teaching practices. Charter schools, for the most part, don't have those work rules. In other words, work rules that mandate, like in DC, when I was chair of the education committee and the superintendent came to me and mayor complaining because the teachers union insisted on keeping a clause in the contract mandating that all teachers leave the premises by 3:15. And they couldn't stay even if they wanted to. So you had these young, energetic teachers that wanted to help with after-school programs, and the principal said, you've got to leave the building, it's 3:16, you're already late. And why did they do that? Because the union contract says there's a certain number of work rules, and if you go beyond that, and you know, look, Mike Podgorski does this better than I ever could in terms of laying out, you know, the ridiculous nature of the work rules. Work rules that allow for teachers that everyone knows are bad teachers to still be on the payroll. Like in New York, and Joe Klein, it took me over there, they have a rubber room. All jurisdictions have some semblance of that. A rubber room in which teachers who are deemed to be unfit to be around children, but they're still on the payroll, and the union rules say they can't be fired. They're in the process of being evaluated. They report to work at 9 and leave at 3, and they haven't seen a child because the system doesn't want them near the children, but they're getting paid by the system. They say in New York, $80 million goes to those teachers who are deemed unfit to be around children and they can't be fired. See, I think that we need to be honest about where we are with these work rules. Thank goodness our new chancellor in DC, Michelle Rhee, she's laid it out there. I was talking to Travis about this earlier. You know, she's a fireball and the union hates her. probably worse than me, which is, but what she's done, she said, look, for this new teacher's contract, plan B, teacher, you can stay in the system, get your $60,000, $70,000 a year, have tenure for life. But plan B, which I'm supporting, which, it's all choice, teachers can decide, it'll be merit pay, you won't have tenure for life, but you can make up to $130,000 a year if you meet your standards and the children are learning. Now, the union hates that. She's going to offer double pay for them to give up tenure, but as Governor Schwarzenegger said to me, he said, Kevin, how can we fix schools in California when teachers in California get automatic tenure for life after 2 years on the job, and they can't be fired? They can't be fired. And the union puts out material saying it takes 5 to 7 years before you know if someone's a good teacher. But before you know they're a good teacher, they've got tenure for life. That's not a bad deal. So, I think that the difference between charter schools that we see when the law is drafted right is they take away that work rule thing where it really, the work rules are really focused on teacher and adult benefits, and puts the emphasis more on the contract between what you're going to do for kids and how you're going to do it. That got some people awake. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about the difference between parental involvement in public schools versus charter schools, and does that contribute to the success of charter schools?
Yeah, I think so. Bureaucracies are self-protecting, and I think that, unfortunately, many bureaucracies and school systems really push parents away. And look, don't take my word for it. I'd love you if you did, but don't take my word for it. I tell you what you do. Walk into a neighborhood school or a couple neighborhood schools. Just walk in and see how they treat you. The good schools will welcome you with open arms, but those schools that are failing schools, they have a common approach. They're like, what do you want? Why are you here? Wait over there. And for low-income parents who are intimidated by schooling and government anyway, it's all about, we don't want you here. You're asking about Johnny? Well, he knows the assignment. What do you want? He just didn't do it. I mean, there's no warmth to the process. The good thing about many charter schools, and not all, and none of this stuff is absolute, because there's some great public schools, I need to say that, and great traditional schools, but I'm talking in terms of the trends, which aren't good. In terms of the trends, some of the better charter schools do a really good job of embracing the community and the parent community and helping them organize. And the principals, like I went to a meeting a couple years ago, and the charter school principal told the parents, and the parents looked at her like she was crazy. We want you to challenge us. And I'm like, what? Yeah. And you know what? We brought in a parent organizer. We want you to start your own parent group. And so you know what questions to ask our teachers? You would never get that in some of these failing traditional schools. And so that's the thing. I mean, I think this whole idea of it being a collaborative undertaking between the parents, the community, and the school leaders is something that we've lost in many of our traditional schools, particularly ones that are failing. Yes, sir.
Maybe I don't understand the process completely, but I think what you said that in charter schools, they're empowered by or chartered by the public school district.
Yeah.
And they derive their money from the public school district. So how is it that the charter schools are able to avoid the work rules then that the public district is encompassed?
Well, they're specifically, exempt from teachers union rules in most places. In Florida, teachers have an option. Charter school teachers have an option, but specifically, and this is the essence of the charter school theory, is that you want to allow as much autonomy as possible for those organizers of the charter school and those who are submitting the application. So they're specifically exempt from the union rules, and that has been a bone of contention. Yes.
So does that mean then the charter school teachers can make a lot more money than what they would be?
They can, well, but in most places they actually make less, because the union rules, you know, they do get their benefits, and a lot of the good charter schools can't afford to pay teachers the same as the local school district, but then they have, you know, a waiting list of applicants. Because as one charter school teacher said to me, who'd been in the traditional system for 20 years, she said, you know, Councilman, this is the first year I felt I could do my job. I didn't have to requisition downtown for a blackboard. I didn't have to wait for supplies. I didn't have, you know, if I needed something, I got it. I didn't have people coming in and telling me, who haven't been in a classroom in 30 years, sit in my classroom and say, you need to do so-and-so. Oh, we stopped doing that 20 years ago, ma'am. You know, you don't get that crazy stuff. Yes, sir.
So this program in Washington, D.C., this incentive-based,
Yes.
is it a proposed program, or is it actually in place? Or?
Well, it is a proposal, and it's a good question. Our Chancellor, Michelle Reed, put that out there, and they've had significant discussions back and forth. They ended up hiring a law school dean to arbitrate, because they couldn't come to an impasse. What our Chancellor and our Mayor have been pushing is put it to a vote. But the union won't put it to the vote of their membership, because they are afraid that the membership will actually approve this. And it will then it will send a shot across the bow to every school district in the country that, you know, it will shake up the automatic tenure system in a way that we haven't seen before in education. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for coming so much. As the person who spent a couple of springs in Jeff City, until we all got charter schools for the state of Missouri, you said before that you had a 20% dropout rate. We had a 20% success rate.
Yeah.
We had a 70% dropout rate based on a study by the St. Louis Public Schools, tracking students 5 years, not 4, but 5 years after they graduated to see if they had completed high school. Plus of the people the students who had graduated, that remaining 30%, only half of them tested at sea level or above. Just so we had maybe, you know, very, very few students succeeding. But we still have substantial educational problems in this area. And I love charter schools, but they are currently being thwarted here.
Yeah.
In many ways. We have a long history in St. Louis of not supporting education. The federal judge, I was serving on the St. Louis Board of Education and every educational board in this area. The federal judge who was our judge for DSEG was Rush Limbaugh's uncle, to give you an idea of how unsupported education has been. So I'm encouraging and challenging everybody in this room, as I turn around and look at each and every one of you, to please not make this an intellectual movement, but to get involved in some way to help improve education in our community. It is so imperative. It is so necessary for our future. Missouri and St. Louis does so little to support to support whatever education.
Right.
I'm not just for public. I served on city academy board as well. Public and private, charter, whatever. Let's have some good education in this area. It's bare. And the authorizing entities in the state of Missouri are often belligerent toward charter schools, anti-charter
That's right.
schools. And I could give examples.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and I understand your message in terms of supporting education, but there's a caveat I'll put there, and some people don't like to hear this, and that means by definition not supporting the status quo. See, because I think that people think that if they get involved and they support some of the folks in the bureaucracy, or they support initiatives in the bureaucracy that have had some spotty success, then they're doing good work. See, I think we need to shake this whole thing up. I mean, I really do. And I think that we need courage to do that. You know, and I'm so proud of the fact that in my party, Democratic Party, which has been really a holdup in terms of reform, that we are now having folks stand up in our party, several big city mayors, because they live with this every day. You know, we can't continue with the negative outputs in our cities. And so, yeah, I think we have to support education, but we have to get knowledgeable enough about what's really going on so we can be conversant on it. And then secondly, we have to have the courage of our convictions to speak out against the status quo. And that's where the union has the biggest stranglehold. I've spoken, have private dinners with the Missouri Black Caucus, with the Georgia Black Caucus, South Carolina Black Caucus, legislators all over the country. And you know, at every one of those opportunities where I speak, there's 2 or 3 people who won't say anything, and when it's over, they pull me aside, they say, man, I like what you're doing, I just can't do it, because, you know, I'm up for re-election, and they'll come after me, and you just keep doing what you're doing. You know, and I tell you, I'm not a violent person, physically violent, but it tests every fiber in my being not to get violent when I hear that, because, you know, if you are a leader and you hold yourself out as a leader of the people, then you need to speak with a courageous tongue on this issue. And one thing you all can do if you have access is you shouldn't support anyone who is weak back on this issue. And it's just that simple. I don't know who's next, I'm sorry. Oh, back here, I'm sorry.
What are the dangers of leaving education entirely in the private sector?
Well, I don't believe it's an either-or proposition. See, there are people, like, my first book was on charter schools, and so people know me as a charter guy. And then they said, well, you're a charter guy, why'd you come out for vouchers? Again, I look at it purely. Look at what's best for kids. See, I think that my dream world is that you have, just like the serving tray in a buffet, you have a variety of options for parents. Some may like chicken fried steak, some may like ravioli. And plus, in today's ever-changing global society, you know, kids respond to different learning modalities. So I wouldn't say everybody has to be in a private school, because, you know, that's like fitting a circle in a square for some folks. See, we have to just, our responsibility is to make education fun and to have these kids like sponges that soak it all in, and to meet these kids where they are. So, no, I think the dangers of having any one system be the predominant system or the only system is it cuts out a whole lot of opportunities for other people who may not respond well to that system to be able to learn. So I really like the idea of just spreading it around. The worst thing in the world is to have a government monopoly. You wouldn't have an iPhone if Judge Harold Green didn't break up Ma Bell back in the 80s. You know, funny story about that. I was a young trial lawyer in the federal court in D.C. I was trying a case. Judge Harold Green was in the middle of breaking up the Bell systems. And during the breaking our trial, he had all these team of lawyers, about 30 lawyers, come up at a bench conference. And then he called us in the back in his chambers. And he said, I shouldn't be talking about this, you know, but I am, because Judge Green was pretty irascible guy. And he said, you know, these Bell phone company lawyers, they drive me crazy. He said, I know I'm going to get a lot of heat, but I'm breaking this thing up. He said, do you know they have things like they call caller ID, and they got like video or picture phones? They've had this technology for 20 years, but they're waiting for the right time to roll it out. This was back in the 80s. He said, you know, he said, I don't know much about business, but I know one thing, unless we get competition out there, it's going to stifle innovation. And, you know, that's the same thing that's happened with our traditional approach to schooling kids. It stifles the innovation at a time we need for it to grow. Just a couple more, I guess. You have one, I'm sorry.
Yeah, my name is Len Tenges. I'm president of Associated General Contractors of St. Louis. We started a charter high school for the construction.
Yes, I
trades
know about your school.
in St. Louis.
That's right.
And I guess my message to the people here is, I look at that charter movement like I look at a health club. Sending in your money to the health club doesn't make you healthy. You've got to work the machines.
That's right.
You've got to work hard. You've got to work at it.
I'm going to use that, by the way.
Consistently.
Should I quote you? I need your name.
But I think that's what happens is people
Yeah.
sit through a lunch like
Yeah.
this, get fired up and walk away.
Yeah.
And as you said, it takes daily dedication.
Yeah.
Go to your industry association, go to your industry group. You're not going to do it by yourself.
Right.
You've got to work collectively,
Absolutely right.
collaboratively. But if you don't do it, we see where we end up.
Yep.
So I appreciate the comment.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
How do you see Teach for America fitting in?
Yeah, I think they're terrific. I really like, I know Wendy Kopp, who started it, and our school chancellor was a Teach for America alum. You know, I think it's, one thing I see the young people over here, well, young people over here, I don't want to.
Very good.
I'm sorry. Yeah, right. I see these young folks surround me. But what's real exciting is I read something very interesting, that this generation of young people under the age of 35 are the most volunteer-oriented generation in American history. They give more of their time, they're more cause-oriented than at any other time. The only comparable time was during the Peace Corps and John Kennedy, but this generation trumps that. And we are seeing, and Wendy's talked about this in Teach for America, and some of these enterprising young charter school operators, you have more and more of our best and brightest being drawn to teaching. Now, why should we have crazy work rules that tell them they can't stay after school to help a kid learn? You know, this is the time when we should just throw these rules out, because you've got the best kids in America who are interested in helping their fellow man. You know, and this is a time to let that continue to grow. And I just think what Teach for America is doing, New Leaders for New Schools, New Teacher Project, all these folks are doing good stuff. Yes, sir.
You mentioned vouchers.
Yes.
You really expanded and talked much about that. But you also mentioned choices.
Yes.
Choices would include private schools and in-home tutoring.
Right, that's right.
But is vouchers the method to open up or expand these choices?
I think that what we found in D.C., because as far as the union is concerned, vouchers is the nuclear bomb. That's radioactive. I mean, you know, so if you have vouchers, then they feel like, okay, we've lost this beachhead, you know. And so I like the idea of, I support all forms of choice. The fastest growing form of choice is homeschooling, which is a direct statement about the condition of our schools. When parents say, I'm just going to do it myself. And if they have any wherewithal, they do it. But, you know, while vouchers are a target, and, you know, people rail against Dr. Friedman and the free market thinking, I think it's the perfect vehicle to highlight the hypocrisy. You know, I mean, because it speaks to all the things that we should be speaking to in terms of competition, allowing innovation to dictate our approach, and those kinds of things. So again, I don't promote one over the other because it's an individual choice. It's far be it for me to tell a parent where they should put their child. But what I can say is, parent, we need to give you options for you to choose for your child, which is what I think, unfortunately, too few public officials are willing to do. Oh, is that it, Rex?
Take one more.
One more, yeah, because he's got a heck of a hook. Yes, ma'am.
Has anyone looked at either a constitutional amendment on a state level or some kind of a law that would prohibit the unionization in public schools?
It would go nowhere.
Why not?
Well, because, you know, look, I just think that the union is the most powerful individual lobby in America, and where they are powerful is not necessarily on Capitol Hill, but in the states, and they wield a lot of clout on individual, you know, legislative races, and I'd be interested to see who you can get to introduce it. you know, state by state. And, you know, I think it's obviously, you know, a good discussion piece, but I just think that'd be a tough row to hoe. That's my view. Y'all can see I say what I think, so.
Kevin, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Rex. Thank you.
Let's take a vote here. I propose that we keep Kevin Chavous in the state of Missouri until we get complete and total reform. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kevin. You folks have evaluation forms at your places. Please fill them out, and I encourage you to go to showmeinstitute.org. And if you like the fight we're waging, we're looking for more warriors. So please join us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.